Welcome to this CHASM seminar that is at a different time to most of our seminars. But as you'll soon appreciate, that's because Kim, our speaker today, is dialing all the way from the States. So it's 8 o'clock in the evening for her. So we're very grateful to her for coming along to deliver this seminar to us. We're on campus today. We've been holding an ECR and PGR event today, the launch of our CHASM PGR ECR network. So it's been really nice to be on campus and doing an in-person event and culminating with this seminar. So thanks everybody for coming along. I'm going to briefly introduce Kim and then I will hand over to her as usual to kick off with the seminar. So Kim Wilson is a senior lecturer in human security and international business at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where she teaches courses in financial inclusion, market approaches to development and transnational human security. Fascinating, and lots going on there. She's also a practitioner in several development sectors, including financial inclusion and micro-franchising. She publishes on the topic of financial resilience and is co-editor of Financial Promise for the Poor, How Groups Build Micro-Savings. You've got so much going on here, Kim. Kim is also academic director for the Fletcher Leadership Programme for Financial Inclusion, as well as for a course sponsored by the Digital Frontiers Institute called Digital Money. And since 2016, her research has focused on the financial passages and resilience of refugees and migrants. And to that end, Kim has overseen studies that have interviewed over 500 migrants and refugees in 10 research sites. Her work and that of other researchers can be found on the Journeys Project site at Tufts University, so do check that out. So much there, Kim, and we are absolutely delighted to have you here. There is so much there that is of absolute key interest to CHASM, but as I was saying to you just now, we have to date not done too much on the financial inclusion, financial lives of migrants and refugees, so we're really happy to welcome you here today. Special thanks to Oslam for organising this seminar today as well. Oslam is the research theme lead for poverty, precarity, savings and debt, and is doing a great job organising seminars in this particular theme today and the next two seminars. Okay, so that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to you, Kim, if that's okay, for you to start sharing your screen and we will kick off.
Great. Well, thank you so much for such a warm welcome. And I'm really interested in what this group does and possibly in attending future seminars. So I appreciate the opportunity. It's great. Let me share my screen.
Okay.
And I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then there's time for Q&A afterwards. Great. And I'm assuming everybody can see that?
We can.
Terrific. So the reason I got interested in this topic was because of a colleague of mine who has studied migration for decades. And she said, why don't you bring your kind of financial services background to the topic? And so I thought, wow, that could be very interesting. So we've been looking at, since 2016, all aspects, let me just close this out here, all aspects of making a journey. So before the journey happens, coping with as it happens, settling in or protracted displacement, and then integrating, which, as you will see, we're going to start off with the journey preparation and coping, moving. But you'll see that integrating isn't really what happens in most situations. It's more like adjusting. So I'm now going to talk about with journey preparation and coping with moving. So in 2016 in Greece, Turkey, and Jordan, and then later in Costa Rica and Colombia, a team of students and myself decided to study the funding and financing issues surrounding refugees and migrants, particularly those involving long distance journeys. More recently, by the way, I have to add, is that we have been looking at migration from Mexico to the US looking at a specific town in Mexico that sends a lot of migrants to the US and what their journeys are like. Always our goal is to understand how these travelers amassed funds before the journey and then access them along the way. So a little bit of background here. I use the term migrants and refugees and asylum seekers somewhat interchangeably, even though they have very different statuses. And the reason is because their backgrounds are very similar. But technically, a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin. And they belong to a particular social group or a group that's ostracized. And they can seek resettlement status into a third country. Or in places like the US, possibly the UK, they can seek that status at the border. That's not very popular with our political people. So why do people leave? Well, for all the reasons you might imagine. There's conflict, political and religious or sexual persecution, grinding poverty, environmental disaster. You think about some of the earthquakes, et cetera, that have sent people on the move. Forced marriage, we're hearing about that more and more, that people either want to avoid it or want to get out of it. And that's particularly women. Household or clan conflicts is very typical. So in Costa Rica, a lot of the people were migrating from Africa to the United States via Brazil and Ecuador because of household conflicts. Social shaming. Your cousin migrated. Why don't you? He has a nice job in the UK. He has a nice job in the US. Why don't you do it? And particularly that's young men. To rejoin family, to pursue education and economic opportunities. And what's not talked about very much, again with young men, is adventure. We heard a lot of young men saying it's the migration season and we're of the migration age. This is what we do. We go out and we seek to know the world. So what routes have we explored? Well, here's a map of some of them. So in Greece, Turkey, and Jordan, we were looking at people from South Asia, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. In Costa Rica and Colombia, we were looking at people coming from South Asia and parts of Africa, again, landing in South America and moving north. How did we do the research? Well, we developed a technique called journey mapping that helped us sketch out financial issues leg by leg. Whenever possible, we interviewed people in their mother tongues. We worked with interpreters when we had to, but for example, in Costa Rica, I brought people that spoke a native Nepali, native Hindi, Bangladeshi, French, Arabic, and even Twi we had a Twi speaking students from Ghana. So here are some examples of routes and costs. So Afghanistan to Greece costs, when we did the study, about $7,500 per person. From home, Syria to Turkey, it was about $500 per person. And the countries border each other, so it's easy to imagine they only had to be smuggled across one border. Eritrea to Greece via Sudan, Israel, Rwanda, and Sudan and Turkey, Sudan twice, by the way, was $14,000. And here's some more numbers. You could go for as little, if you're a stowaway, for $1,750 if you're moving from Ghana to the US. But if you're from Bangladesh, prepare to spend about $26,000, and so on and so forth. And here's an example of really pricey smuggling trips. So most of the routes, the costs of the routes are because of smuggling. That's where the big costs come in. Some people prefer to self-smuggle and they take a big risk. There's no protection for them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the financing works. So this is an example of what people were calling the guarantee scheme. So you have a starting point, right, in Afghanistan, and the destination is Germany. So a kingpin smuggler will contact a local smuggler and start to prepare the refugee for the journey. The refugee visits a money agent in downtown Kabul. And these money agents go by different names. Saraf, you might have heard the term Hawaldar. And the refugee deposits $7,500 with this agent. The agent contacts the smuggler and says, hey, the refugee's good for it. I've got her money, you can proceed. So he then gets his local smuggler to bring the refugee to the first waypoint, in this case, Iran. And then the local smuggler says, yeah, I brought her there. And so the agent in Kabul will contact the smuggler and say, okay, he got her there. I'm going to release your first piece of money, your first $2,500 of the $7,500. And then the second waypoint, the same thing happens until the refugee reaches. So that's what I would classic refugee scheme. There are also schemes involving banks. So this is an example from Nepal with the cost of $40,000 to deliver the refugee to the US. By the way, these trips can take a very long time. They can move as quickly as a week and take years. So here's how that works. As the refugee reaches each waypoint, the passing smuggler, meaning the local one that's handling, notifies the payment smuggler, who alerts the family and says, all right, your brother or your oldest son just made it to Ecuador. Please pay the first tranche. And so the family does so. They're asked to break the deposits down into sums less than 1,000 so as not to create red flags for the bank. Because all of this is illegal, as you can imagine, including how the money works. This is not legal to do this. And the scheme gets very complicated. Simple arrows would not suffice here, where sometimes you're depositing on another refugee's behalf or another migrant's behalf. And through various checks and balances, the smugglers work it out. There's the 3 tries approach, which we saw in Honduras and also Athens. So people could not move north through Costa Rica directly to Mexico because the Nicaraguan borders are sealed. So the smuggler would charge a flat fee and the refugee and the migrant would pay up front. And they had 3 attempts for that amount of money in both cases. So it's interesting that this is kind of a global strategy. The incentives are aligned because the smuggler makes more of a profit if he can deliver the refugee in the first or second try. We're seeing in Mexico, by the way, and the US, that the tries are as many as possible with some of the smugglers. It's not just 3. Then there's this interesting, I thought, pay it forward scheme. So in this case, the smuggler gets paid as his network delivers the refugees to each person, just like we talked about in the guarantee scheme. But in this case, the refugee has no money. The sister lives in Khartoum. When her brother signals her that he's ready to cross, she contacts the smuggler. They negotiate a price. In this case, it's $12,500. The sister then contacts 20 or so members of the Eritrean diaspora because that's where he's originating. He's Eritrean. And they send money to the sister's mobile money account. The refugee never has to repay what essentially is a loan, right? Because it came from all over. But once he gets to Europe, he's expected to be part of the diaspora. And when the next refugee needs to flee Eritrea, he will be expected to help fund that person's journey. So that's how that works. How do people access their funds? Remittances through formal providers, as you might imagine, like Western Union. Remittances through the Hawala, which we'll talk about in a moment. Kinship finance, gifts and loans from fellow travelers, and by stopping along the way and earning a living. So remittances from formal providers. Well, people definitely wanted to work with, use Western Union, MoneyGram, a variety of formal providers, meaning they're regulated providers. They said their services were reliable. However, they often didn't have the identity documents they needed, and locals would charge them about 10% to use their identity documents. So if I have a brother in Afghanistan and he wants to send me money through Western Union, I would find a local, they would use their IDs. As you can imagine, for those of you that understand know your customer due diligence rules, this is illegal. Remittances through Hawalas. Well, Hawalas are interesting. Some of you are probably very well aware of how they work, but I'm going to go through it very quickly. You have somebody that wants to send money, and they approach their money agent, the Hawaldar in this case, and the Hawaldar contacts his agent. So imagine this is Afghanistan. I want to send money to Greece. The Hawaldar in Greece receives the message from the Hawaldar in Afghanistan and says, okay, I will pay out this money to a refugee if she approaches me. So it's a simple system, and then they reconcile their accounts through various settlement strategies. The positives were that migrants and refugees are extremely familiar with this type of service. And they provide doorstep banking in some cases. The concerns are they know the hawala is illegal and they don't want to be caught. They feel very vulnerable. Kinship finance gets very complicated. This is financial relationships among family, diaspora. Two examples are Syrians in Jordan and Haitians in Mexico. But here's how it worked in Jordan. So Adnan and Amira are Syrians living in Turkey. Adnan's sister Hannah lives in Jordan and needs money. Adnan calls Muhammad, his friend in Jordan, and says, please give Hannah 20 Jordanian dollars. Muhammad gives her it should be 20. She gives her the 20 Jordanian dollars. The next month, Amira needs money in Turkey. So Muhammad calls Adnan and asks him to give Amira 50 Jordanian dollars, and Adnan does so. On and on this goes, back and forth, back and forth. But the problem is somebody often is left holding the bag in terms of basically a lot of debt. And it works well in very symmetrical transactions, but it doesn't work well because of mental accounting issues, and it can be fraught with family conflict. Gifts and loans from fellow travelers. We saw this a lot, particularly in South America, where travelers were getting money from each other to help them move forward because they would tend to move forward in groups to stay safe. And co-travelers were not fussy about being paid back. People would also earn a living along the way. They would stop and say, okay, I can't move any further. I don't have money, so I'm going to work as a cleaner. I'm going to work in agriculture. Those that were lucky and educated could do a lot of other kinds of work, gig work, basically, in all kinds of activities that were associated with the digital world. So what happens when they reach a destination, whether it's one that's reluctant, meaning they didn't want to reach there, they wanted to reach somewhere else, or aspirational, they got to their goal. So after the journey, we'll talk now about settling and coping. What happens? Well, our studies in Mexico, Uganda, Kenya, and Jordan, and also in the United States and Tunisia, which is not listed here, we learned that there's a difference between a welcoming economy and an unwelcoming economy. So in a welcoming economy, and by the way, we're using that term very broad in a brushstroke, which means it's not necessarily one that says you have a pathway to citizenship or you have a pathway to a work permit. It's one that often just turns a blind eye, that says, we know you're here and we're not going to crack down very much. So in those economies, people go through a very clear stepped process where they might live on handouts at the early stages of arrival, maybe months 1 and 2, a local church or mosque might be offering them funds. And then they start to get their bearings. They learn the city a little bit. All this research was done in urban and peri-urban areas. We did do some camp-based research and we saw the same thing. They enter what we call the survivalihood phase, right? They're making money, but it's just enough to put food on the table, nothing more. Again, as they start to get their bearings, they start to blossom, their livelihoods start increasing and growing. So here's an example of Marie and Emmanuel. So they're a couple from the DRC, and they've arrived in Kampala, Uganda, with not a penny to their name. Marie is able to attend a 7-month course, and they live on handouts, by the way, for the first month or two. Marie attends a 7-month course in cosmetology, but she's not producing any income. Emmanuel gets odd jobs in construction for about $2 a day, right? So they start to enter that survivalihood phase. Marie works in a hair salon for 7 months, and she's earning about $110 at that point, but she quits. Childcare and transportation are simply too expensive for her. Emmanuel begins to learn English, and that is a big boost for a lot of people. If they can learn the local language they're in and a continental language, I guess I would call it a colonial language, like English or French. Marie, attends a tailoring course, again, producing no income. But Emmanuel begins to broker construction materials between Uganda and the DRC. And he was starting to receive handsome commissions. Marie, that finances Marie. She starts her own business, buys a machine, one machine at a time, and she begins to train others for less than $1 a day. And she's still earning less than $1 a day from sewing. And Emmanuel, his business increases, and so he continues to fund her business. And as you can see here, she is earning up to $130 a month for all 4 income streams. She has a tailoring business, she has a sewing business, she's selling katange, and she's doing some hair work out of her home, salon work out of her home. So at the beginning, their portfolios are very simple, right? There's charity from the church, they're spending on the basics, and their financial instruments are barter, cash, and the mattress. But as their business starts to ratchet up and they move out of the survivalihood phase into the ratcheting phase, you can see that their portfolios become much more complex. All the green represents the different cash flows into the household. The red represents the expenses. And you can see that they're still doing the mattress, barter, and cash, but they also have an MFI, a microfinance institution savings account. They have a microfinance loan. They belong to 2 savings clubs that were organized by the International Rescue Committee, and then 2 tontines, which are traditional savings club. And then they have 2 mobile money accounts, and they plan to open an account at Equity Bank, which is very present in Uganda. So here are 2 examples. Gilles comes from Rwanda to Uganda, and you can see how he's able to ratchet up his income. So we would have called Uganda a welcoming economy. And he starts off and he trades up his assets. He can barely support his needs at the beginning. Then he starts to rent a motorbike and run errands. And then he has enough to buy the motorbike, and he can keep all the profits. And then he learns how to drive a car, and he becomes an Uber driver. And the last we spoke to him, he plans of buying his Uber car. So this is what financial services look like in a welcoming economy. There's income from handouts. They start off in the arrival phase. There's income from very meager livelihoods. And then in the livelihoods phase, there's income from all sorts of areas, as we discussed, but all kinds of additional services are needed. So they might start at the mattress, move to savings clubs, and then very quickly find use for financial services. They can pay back a microloan. They can, yes, they can save. And we didn't see many signs of insurance, but I think that's coming down the pike. Well, in a less welcoming economy, people never get out of the survivalihood phase. Their businesses move beyond in fits and starts, and they never move beyond the basics. So here's an example in Jordan of a Syrian couple. And as you can see, basically their livelihoods are decreasing in income. COVID strikes in the middle of this. That has a huge impact. One of their sons loses a job, and they can't really make their way into even a survivalihood stage. At this point, they're desperate. So we started looking at, and I believe this is my last slide, financial health versus financial services. And financial health is something I've gotten a lot of interest, I have interest in, because it's looking at outcomes, not just service provision. And so we would say, we took the financial health concept from the Financial Health Network, and then we adapted it to what we saw with our own study. And so our indicators of financial health are: 1, can people meet their basic needs? Can they recover from financial setbacks, from shocks? Can they comfortably manage their debts? Do they expand their planning horizons from, let's say, a day upon arrival, they're living hand to mouth, to year or several years? And that's a sign of financial health. And do they have the ability to invest in opportunities, whether it's through savings or credit? And our actual finding is that financial services have a greater impact on financial health in a welcoming economy, that those services can be put to good use to create financial health, but a whole lot of other things are needed to create financial health. Financial services is only one, and I'm happy to talk about the other needs during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. That was incredibly slick, incredibly comprehensive, fascinating stuff, and so much there to unpick and unpack. Well, certainly from my perspective. So thank you very much. I think we actually